start with a question to you. How many species are shown here? What we see here is actually the result of coevolution. So there are two species. On the left-hand side, it's Heliconius aurata. On the right-hand side, it's Heliconius melpomene. These are species that are so-called polymorphic. So they don't look the same at different locations in South America where they occur. In fact, what's happening here is that each line here is in the same region in South America. So these two species here look like this if they occur together in a particular region. If you go to another region, they look like that. It's still the same species here, but they have converged to the same kind of pattern, which is called mimicry, of course, as you can easily see. Now, this is actually how they occur. So these are the two species, melpomene, aurato, and you see the color codes here. For example, this one occurs here, and you can see in this area, this one looks like that, and this one looks like that. So they converge regionally. This is a spectacular result of coevolution. And the idea is, if you converge to a common pattern, the predators presumably are much quicker and actually much more efficient to learn that they should avoid them, because these butterflies contain some toxic substances that they, by the way, get from the plants to ward off the predators, so they don't taste very well. I can't resist at this point, because I don't know whether Darwin is a hero, but I think he's one of the most important scientists, actually the most effective scientist also that we know. And his theory is one of the grand theories of science that we have come up with as humankind. And in contrast to many other grand theories in science, like quantum theory, relativity, it's very, very easy to understand. And it goes in a few steps, and it's worthwhile going through these steps. He requires three prerequisites, so to speak. One is individuals in the population vary in their traits, in their phenotype. We can easily verify that. This variation is partially heritable, so there is genotypic variation for this trait. And in fact, one can show that there is a genotypic basis for fecundity differences in human populations. That comes out from very recent studies. It's very, very small, but it's there. So it's heritability. And of course, in each family, parents are proud that their children look like papa or like mama. So actually, we all enjoy this heritability in some sense. The third point is that more offspring are born than are able to survive and reproduce by themselves. This is probably less of a drastic limit in humans, but we think of developed countries here mostly. If you go to some other places, this is not true. And it's certainly not true for most animals. If you think about fish, they produce millions of eggs, of which on average just 2 reach maturity and survive, because they replace their parents, mom and dad, and the long-term population stays more or less the same. So of these 10 million eggs that the fish female produces, 2 of them are on average able to survive. Against this background, Darwin concludes that is among these 10 million eggs is those 2 that lead to, let's say, juvenile and adult fish, which have more suitable phenotypes that will have higher chances to survive. So this is a statistical argument. Even very small differences of that kind lead to something which translate into more or less success. This is what we call as the adaptation process based on selection. And as a fifth consequence of that, if that is true, and you can verify each step independently, it's done many, many times, then inevitably these variants which are better suited for their environment will accumulate in the population, and the population adapts. So this is a population process, and one has to keep this in mind. If you talk about biology, it's not individuals that adapt, although they're the carrier of these adaptations, but it's the population as a whole that adapts to its environment. Coevolution is nothing else than evolution in relation to other taxa. For example, this could be something that is your neighbor in the population, which is not a taxa in the classical sense, of course, or it could be members of other species. If we think about selective factors or environment that you have to adapt to, then there are clearly abiotic factors such as physical and chemical conditions. Keyword here would be, for example, global change, climate warming would be a physical factor, and there are biotic factors. And my message here is that biotic factors, so members of your own species or members of other species that share the environment you do, are much, much, much more important than any physical or chemical factor. This is the most important source of adaptation or of selective pressures, and we will see examples of that. So if you want to sketch the evolutionary process, you can think of a line A and a line B. For example, this butterfly and its predator, or in this case, for example, the bee produces something, a substance which is square, and it has a receptor, for example, line A, that recognizes square, and if this one fits in this one, then it does damage. This would be, for example, a host-parasite situation. We come to that in a second. This could be a protein, a molecule, and this could be a receptor on the cell surface, and if you match it, you can infect and do damage. If that is the case, after a while, of course, line A has to change, or it is actually pressured to change, if there's some variation to change them. So if there are some round variants around, in addition to the square ones, these round variants will increase in frequency, and we see that the population changes from square to round, and it will exert another selection pressure now back to the other line, which then, of course, has to change from square, for example, to round. And so the game goes back, and now this one has to change maybe to a triangle. So coevolution is nothing else than selection exerted by one line to the other, and vice versa. Does this thing happen? Well, this is a classical case, horse evolution. Horses emerged in the Eocene here, so 50, 60 million years ago. You see here the series of different horses, so this is the proto, so to speak, our today's horse, different continents. What is important here, what is interesting, is if you look not only at the horses here, but at their teeth, what you can see is that over time, so this is the beginning of horse evolution, this is today, between 0 and 60 million years ago, you can see that the hypsodontic index, which is nothing else than actually the size of the tooth, has increased over evolutionary time. Why is this so? There has been a coevolution with the grass that the horse eats. The grass is not very happy about being eaten, so what the grasses do is they produce silica, so very hard substances that are hard to digest, and of course also damage the teeth. And what's happening on the other side of the horse is that the teeth get larger and larger to cope with this kind of selection pressure that the grasses exert. So the grasses get harder with more silica. At the same time, the horses get better teeth to actually chew on the grasses. And you can see that this is a kind of an arms race, has been called an arms race, that lead to more and more or exaggerated traits or a larger trait, for example, higher teeth or larger teeth. This is a classical example. Of course, we have a lot of things that we can attribute to coevolution. Mimicry, we already mentioned that with the butterflies. This is a particular kind of mimicry called the Bayesian mimicry. There's a model which is poisonous, toxic, the coral snake, which has a poisonous bite. And there's a mimic, the king snake, which is harmless, but it mimics this one in the same habitat, and the predator is fooled. So this is to fool predators. Let's now go into one specific kind of coevolution. This is between the host and the parasite, because this has one of the most dramatic consequences, and actually it's something that we can also follow over a short time scale. That host-parasite coevolution is happening, you can see, for example, in this well-known phenomenon of drug resistance. If you just look at the top here, this is the year 1940-2010. For example, here are shown the antimalarials. These are drugs that we produce as humans and throw it against to the parasites, which is, by the way, Plasmodium and protozoan. And what you see here is that the lengths of these green lines indicate how long these anti-malaria drugs have been effective. For example, here, chloroquine has been introduced in 1945. About 10, 15 years later, 1955, it was already ineffective. It was replaced, for example, by mefloquine a little bit later. It was ineffective within a few years. And so you get the idea. As we, as humans, introduce a new drug, the parasites adapt. And what they do is co-evolve with our drugs, right? And we co-evolve with the parasites because we have to invent new drugs all the time. We're now at a point in time where things get rather critical because we run out of such drugs, and we get more and more multi-drug resistant strains. And you can see it doesn't happen over millions of years, it happens within years and decades. So it's rather fast, and you can observe it. Here's the selection pressure. The more you use antibiotics, the more you get drug resistance. Here, for example, daily antibiotic dose for different countries here of Europe, and you see the resistance that is measured in certain diseases, and you can see a very nice correlation. The more you use the drugs, actually, the more resistance you create. This is evolution. Selection pressure here, the result of selection pressure is adaptation by this population of bacteria or protozoans that actually are targeted. Now let's have a look at the fine mechanics of host-parasite coevolution. Imagine that there are two different host lines, let's say two different individuals in the human population, and there are two different strains, strain A and B, let's say two different malaria strains or flu virus or whatever. Now often you find a situation which is characterized by this table here. Let's say strain A is able to infect host A, so it infects, but is not able to infect host B. And vice versa, strain B, for example, is not able to infect host A, but is able to infect host B. And in fact, you certainly know that if a cold runs around the population, not everybody gets it. Maybe your neighbor gets it, but maybe you not. And naturally, there is variation in resistance and susceptibility to diseases. Look what's happening if, let's say, in the population, so this is the entire population, most of the hosts are of type B, and a few are of type A. If you have a strain B, this is a very successful strain, because most of the hosts it encounters here, strain B, will be infected. So the parasite has a good life, but the host does not. So in other words, the host of type B will have a disadvantage, and the host of type A is resistant to strain B here, will have an advantage. So what you will see over a very short time is that actually hosts of type A will accumulate. Remember Darwin's 5 steps. They are better at type, and so they will increase in frequency. So after a while, you will find that host A has actually taken over almost all of the population, and the situation reverses. The colors would reverse now, so A would be dominant and B would be very infrequent. And as you go along here, then strain A comes along and would reverse the situation again. And what you get here is that as you cycle through these 4 different quarters, you will see that over time, strain B, for example, makes its living by infecting host B. It gets more and more of host A, so actually this will be less favored. So over time, actually what we get here is a kind of cycle here that leads you to the 4 possibilities and actually the change of host A and B and strain A and B. Now to show that actually, you can, instead of going through the table, you can sort of roll it out along the time axis. And what you will get is something like that. These will be generations, arbitrarily 4,000 generations, 4,100. And you will get an up and down of the frequency of the host, the blue line, and an up and down of the frequency of the parasite. If you think about this frequency, for example, representing the blue host or the red parasite. Doesn't matter exactly which is which here, except that here the parasite is following the blue host, so the red parasite is following the blue host, and as it increases in frequency, it represses actually the frequency of the blue host because it starts to infect it at large numbers, and so on. So what we get here is a cycling, and in fact, this is, by the way, very different from the arms race, because there's no novelty in here. It's just sort of exchanging A for B and B for A and A for B and B for A, but there's nothing new. So it's not going anywhere, it's actually just running at a spot. And this is, by the way, why this has been called the Red Queen scenario. What is underlying it is negative frequency-dependent selection, which means that the rarer you are as a type, the better you are protected, the fitter you are. So if you're very common, you're not in very good shape. If you're rare, you have an advantage. In our cultures, being different from everybody else is actually a cultural value. This is not everywhere the case. And if you look at the frequencies of first names, it's quite striking. Not claiming this is actually the reason, but it's quite striking that you too find sort of an increase in frequency, for example, of Noah. You find a decrease in frequency of Luca. You find a sort of unchanged frequency of Alexander. And I'm afraid to say Paul is very unpopular, so maybe it makes him come back here at some point. At least I'm very infrequent, so I'm very different from most, maybe not here in the audience, but most of the newborns here. But when you look at these patterns of name giving, they also reflect something like negative frequency dependent selection. So the rarer the name, the better it seems to be for the parents to choose that. Not sure whether it's actually true in that way. Now comes the hardcore bit of biology. Being different has a lot to do with reproduction. Name giving is a kind of reproduction if you want. Let's look at a situation where you do reproduce asexually. In this case, it means that the offspring here is an exact copy of the parent. An offspring here is an exact copy of the parent. This is not the case in sexual reproduction, where you have a female and a male that both contribute a half to the offspring. So the offspring is always different from the parents. So sexual reproduction has a quality which means your offspring will be different than you are, either of the parents, because it's a mixture of both contributions from father and mother. Before actually parents give on their gene contribution to the offspring, they start to recombine it, to put it together in new ways. This is how it looks like. This is a cell, let's say a sperm cell that develops. It has chromosomes from their father and their mother, and before they actually produce the actual sperms, which are haploid cells that infuse the diploids, they actually start to exchange genes among these fatherly and motherly genes that you have inherited. Now, this is a very strange process because the equivalent is this one. Let's say this would be father, this would be mother. Of course, it has to be that way. This is adapted to very fast driving. This is adapted maybe to actually go and shop a lot of things, bring it back home. So this, we could reverse it for the sake of correctness here. But what you have here is you produce offspring, let's say, of these two models. And what you get, of course, is in some cases you get your father's phenotype, in some cases you get your mother's phenotype. But in half of the cases you get something like that. And that just doesn't make sense. I mean, why should you actually disrupt your very, very good genotype to produce offspring, although you have been so successful in this genotype to be able to reproduce? And this is actually why biologists have still today wonder why sex exists and why actually recombination exists at all, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. It could make a lot of sense if to be different is something that you want. And we tested that, and this is a piece of own work just to show you how this works, and it shows you can co-evolve things in a lab. It needs not millions of years, you can do it in a lab. So the species here is the flower beetle. It lives in flowers, as the name says. And what we did here, for example, is you let it live, you after a certain while you stop it, you let it reproduce and take the offspring to the next generation, and to the next generation, and so on. This is the control. In the co-evolved part of the experiment, you do actually the same thing. So you let the host or the beetle live here in the flower, but now you add a parasite, which in this case is fungus or Nosema microsporidium. Doesn't matter so much. But now actually what you do is you let these beetles lay eggs, and the successful ones you take on, and the successful parasite you also take on or take further. The successful ones were the ones that have killed your beetles. And so you add it back again to the next generation, and you repeat that, and you repeat that, and you repeat it. And the question was here, would this co-evolved scheme actually do something to the population? Recall, evolution is in population. That would make offspring more different than under the controlled conditions. In this particular case, we looked at the average rate of recombination in the population. Now this is the result, and as you may imagine from my introduction, if you just look at these two things, if the host here, this beetle, co-evolves with these parasites, over only 10 to 12 generations, the population will start to recombine more than if it does not. So what we have here is something which shows us, yes indeed, at least this would be correct with our image that being different is something that is good against parasites. Actually, it also maintains genetic variation. It just shows here, this is, for example, number of alleles, different versions of the same gene that circulate in the population. And for example, here, the co-evolves are all the dotted lines. You should always compare between these groups. And in each case, actually, the dotted lines are above the dashed lines, which means that as these generations unfold, the genetic variation in the population is maintained. It's a process based on co-evolution. Do humans co-evolve? This is an example. We all drink milk. It's actually not so self-evident as you might think, because normally humans can only digest milk as babies from mother's milk. It's dependent on an enzyme called lactase, different versions of that exist, which is able to break down lactose, one of the milk proteins, which is hard to digest. We lose this ability normally during our adult life, but in the populations it persists to a certain degree. Now this degree to which it persists, so adults can still digest milk, varies a lot across human populations. This is a graph of actually, on one hand, the gene diversity in the milk of cattle today. So cattle have 6 different milk proteins. People have gone, sequenced that, do some analysis, and you see the highest diversity of gene diversity in milk is actually here in northern Germany, Poland, and that kind of things. This corresponds rather nicely with the occurrence of a high frequency of the ability to digest milk as adult. Lactase tolerance is called. Actually, the dotted line is the Neolithic cattle pastoral race. So in the Neolithic, actually people have started to use cattle, and this is where they lived, and it's actually quite amazing to see this is still a hotspot of ability to digest milk. It goes even further. If you look across the planet, actually you see that lactose intolerance, so red is very high intolerance, like China, green is very low intolerance, so ability to digest, like Europe here. It is actually the case that it reflects the milk consumption, more or less, for obvious reasons. If you go to Africa, this is a very recent study which is really interesting, it shows that actually these African people which live in the Sudan and Kenya and Tanzania have different versions of this lactase enzyme. And each of one seems to have evolved independently and actually in concert with the use of cattle as a dairy food source. So this is coevolution between your own culture, so starting to use cattle, and the ability to use the product, which is reflected in a genetic change in human populations. So we have examples where we see rapid evolution is a few thousand years, and which we can trace back to some pressure like culture. I will end with 3 slides, which I don't comment very much, but some food for thought, all about parasites. There's an incredible tight correlation between the disease richness in a country, so each dot is a different country worldwide. The data are from the WHO and other sources, and the number of denominations, religions that are counted per country, according to the official canon and official classification. Countries that have a lot of diseases have a lot of religions. They have controlled for all sorts of factors, socioeconomic status, what have you. Very neat correlation. There is a correlation between infectious diseases and language diversity. This is statistics for those who are familiar with statistics. So this is a highly significant correlation between the disease richness, registered by the WHO in a particular country here, and the number of living languages, according to the linguists. Even if you err there by a little bit, the correlation is still very strong. These are 50 states of the US, so from Illinois to New York to Florida. And it shows that the higher the parasite stress, which is measured by the reports of the health authorities, so how many patients are delivered to the hospital and how many deaths and how many whatever I have from parasitic infections here. But this is the average IQ that you measure in this state. The more parasite stress, the lower the intelligence average in this state. Food for thought. So coevolution, exclamation mark, is affected by interaction with others. It's one of the most powerful processes in nature. Actually, much of what you see is coevolution, or the result of coevolution. It leads to diversity. The world would look very, very different if there were no coevolution. It can lead to phenomena such as sex and recombination, and sex is a very, very important property also for humans. Just think about all the culture and Tristan and Isolde, whatever. I mean, all that would not happen without parasites, I would claim here. And in humans, coevolution even happens with one's own culture and many other things. So coevolution, really something that you should think of. Thanks.